The bundle sat on his desk for 2 weeks before anyone asked about it. Small thing, cedar and sage wrapped in a strip of deer hide, tied with something that might have been sinew or might have been grass. It smelled like smoke and cold stone, and something else Olin Carver couldn't name. He'd found it on his desk one Tuesday morning when he unlocked the jail. No note, no boot prints in the mud outside that he didn't recognize. Just the bundle, sitting there like it had always been there, between his coffee tin and the county warrant book. He didn't throw it out. He didn't know why. Olin Carver was 26 years old and had arrived in Ridgepost, Colorado territory with a leather satchel, a deputy's badge, and 4 years of education at the Fairmont School in Richmond, Virginia, where he'd studied alongside the sons of congressmen and studied hard enough that a few of them shook his hand at graduation. He was proud of that. He thought it meant something about the kind of man he was. Ridgepost was a single block of unpainted buildings at the eastern edge of the Uncompahgre Plateau. The mud on its main street never fully dried, even in summer. The town had a trading post, a saloon with a piano that needed tuning, a doctor who charged $3 a visit, and roughly 300 people who'd come west for land or a fresh start on a second chance. It also had a population of Ute families who still moved through the plateau and the canyon country below it, hunting, gathering, living on what was left of land that had been theirs completely until very recently. The relationship between Ridgepost and those families was, Olin liked to say, complicated. He said it with the tone of a man who'd studied the subject. What he meant was, he hadn't chosen a side, and he thought that was fairness. The runner came on a Wednesday in November. Young man, maybe 17, who'd ridden hard. His horse's breath came in great rolling clouds when he pulled up outside the jail. He spoke to Olin in Ute first, and when Olin held up one hand and said he didn't have the language, the runner switched to Spanish. And when Olin shook his head again, the runner exhaled through his nose, clearly revising his opinion of the deputy downward, and said in careful English, "Woman sick, very sick, fever 4 days. Medicine keeper is in the mountains. No one knows when he comes back." He'd stopped. Then, "You are the law."
What does being the law have to do with a fever?
The runner looked at him for a moment. Then he said simply, "We have tried everything else." Olin went to find Dr. Purcell first. That took 6 minutes. Purcell listened, nodded, poured himself another cup of morning coffee, and said he didn't make house calls past the town boundary. Certainly not to an encampment, certainly not in November. And was there anything else? There was not. Olin walked back into the cold and stood in the mud for a moment, working through his options. Bee Trowell saved him from himself. She was 60 years old, ran the only decent herb supply in the territory, and had lived on the plateau long enough that her knowledge of its plants was, Olin later understood, encyclopedic. She appeared at her shop door as he was passing, took one look at his face and said, "The Ute camp?"
How did you...
I got the poultice ready.
I didn't see you.
Come in, Olin.
She talked the whole time she packed. Yarrow for fever reduction, willow bark tea for the pain that came with high fever, clean linen, and a copper pot if he could find water nearby. She told him to keep the patient's head elevated and to watch the color of the fever. Yellow meant one thing, red meant another. Gray meant get everyone out of the lodge and start praying. She also told him, flatly, to listen to whoever was in that camp and knew more than he did, which was likely to be everyone.
This knowledge, it's what'll keep you safe. You know what they taught you about medicine at that school of YORs?
Some. Basic. Basic.
Right. And you know what's on this plateau that'll heal the same things your school prescribed? Me neither. But the women who've been living here for
The encampment was a 2-hour ride south and down, off the plateau face and into the protected notch where 12 lodges sat in a curved line facing east. Olin smelled the cooking fires before he saw the lodges, and he heard children before he saw anything. That detail would stay with him. Hahawi met him at the boundary. He was a man of 28, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that was part trade wool and part something Olin couldn't place. He spoke English without accent. Later, Olin would wonder where he'd learned it, and then stop wondering, because the answer to that question was a door he didn't quite want to open. Ha'awi looked at the saddlebag. He looked at Olin's badge. He said,
You come as a
Olin didn't know how to answer that, so he said the only true thing he had. I came because no one else would. Ha'awi studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. 4 days. That's what it took. Not the 4 days Olin had expected. Not dramatic, not heroic. Just grinding close work in a small lodge that smelled of dried sage and something sweeter he couldn't identify. The patient's name was Sakwa Yampa, and her father, Yampa Tukudu, sat outside the lodge entrance most of the time without speaking. Olin interpreted this as grief or worry. He'd eventually understand it differently. The fever ran hot, then broke, then ran hot again. Ha'awi was there most of the time, watching everything Olin did with an expression that couldn't be called anything but evaluation. Every few hours he asked, "Is it working?" And every few hours Olin gave him the honest answer, which was some variation of, "I don't know yet." On the third day, the fever broke for real, or so it seemed. Sakwa opened her eyes, and for the first time, they were clear. She looked at the ceiling of the lodge for a moment, then she looked at Olin, and she said something in Ute, maybe 6 words, steady and deliberate, like she'd been saving them up. Olin looked at Ha'awi. Ha'awi's jaw tightened. He said it like it cost him something.
She says you have the wrong hands for this work, Del.
Olin looked back at Sakwa. She'd already closed her eyes. Then the fever came back. Day 4 was the hardest. The fever spiked in the early hours before dawn. The color B. Trowell had called red, which meant push the willow bark tea and keep the patient's temperature from climbing further. Olin worked by firelight, alone except for Ha'awi, who sat against the far wall and didn't sleep either. At some point around 3 in the morning, Ha'awi said without preamble,
My grandmother went to one of their schools in Utah. She came back speaking English and not speaking anything else.
Olin didn't answer right away. He was wringing out a cloth. He said, I'm sorry. Ha'awi's expression didn't change. He said, I didn't tell you so you'd apologize. I told you so you know what I'm looking at when I look at you. Around 7, Sakwa came around again. This time the consciousness held. She spoke slowly, in Ute first, then in English when she realized Olin was the one there. Her English was careful and specific, the kind of English that comes from having chosen to learn it rather than having had it forced in. She asked for water. She asked how long she'd been down. When Olin told her 4 days, she closed her eyes briefly. Not from weakness, he thought, but from calculation.
East bundle, north bundle. Her knowledge is foundational. The north bundle there. Serviceberry drying.
He used the willow bark?
He used the willow bark, that's right.
A woman named Beatrice in it.
Sakwa made a sound that might have been a small laugh. She knows things, more than she lets on at the trading post. Then she asked, what school did you go to? The question came out of nowhere. Olin told her, the Fairmont School in Richmond, 4 years of study, Latin, rhetoric, law, natural sciences. Sakwa looked at the ceiling. She said quietly,
They burned schools like mine.
Olin opened his mouth, closed it.
Your badge isn't worth the paper it's printed on here.
This is our land. No, wait, I understand.
Name it.
She didn't explain. She asked him to name the dried plant hanging in the east bundle, the one closest to the smoke hole. He couldn't. She told him, "Osha root, used for fever that comes with cold." He wouldn't forget it. He didn't know yet that he wouldn't forget it. By midday, she was sitting up. By mid-afternoon, she said Dunmore's name. Fisk Dunmore was the federal Indian agent for the district, a man of 45 who wore his certainty like a second coat, equally well-fitted and equally waterproof. He'd been through Ridgepost twice in the past month, and each time he'd spoken to Yampa Tukudu about the children in the encampment, about their futures, about a school in Denver with warm beds and English instruction, and 3 meals a day that would open doors, he said, that the plateau would never open for them.
He has papers now. He told my father last week. Documentation authorizing removal. My younger brothers are on that list. My youngest sister.
Olin set down the tin cup he was holding. "When is he coming?"
He said, "Before the next snow." The next snow is close.
Olin sent a rider to Ridgepost that afternoon with a note for the county clerk. He needed the territorial statutes on federal Indian agent authority, specifically the counter-signature requirements for removal orders. The clerk was a meticulous woman named Prentice, who sent back 4 pages by nightfall with relevant passages flagged. Olin read them twice by firelight. Dunmore's documentation needed the territorial governor's countersignature to be enforceable. Without it, the order was federal paper with no local standing. Olin knew, reading it, that Dunmore almost certainly didn't know this. Men of bureaucratic certainty often didn't bother checking the local statutes. That was someone else's job. Dunmore arrived the following morning. 2 federal riders behind him, both with the look of men who'd done this particular job before and found it unremarkable. Dunmore himself rode up to the encampment boundary at a pace that suggested he expected no resistance. The pace of a man arriving to deliver news, not start a negotiation. Olin stepped out of Sequa's lodge to meet him. He hadn't planned to stand there. He just walked out and stood there. And it wasn't until he was standing in the cold morning air with the document tucked under his arm that he thought, "I'm doing this."
Deputy, didn't expect to find you down H. Reese? Yes, I am here. Agent Dunmore, what's in the document?
Removal authorization. 7 children listed by name to be transported to the Territorial Education Facility in Denver. Signed by...
Hold on. Countersigned by the territorial governor? You knew the terms.
A pause. Dunmore's horse shifted.
Absolute, Mr. Dunmore. Stand with us then. With you, always. We await them.
The canyon wind came up then, that low, sustained tone against the rock face that Olin had been hearing for 4 days without knowing its source. He heard it clearly now. He also heard footsteps, not his own. He didn't turn around right away. He kept his eyes on Dunmore, but he heard them, and he knew from the sound of moccasins on cold ground that he was no longer standing alone. Olin turned his head, just slightly. Ha'awi was to his left, 1 step back, arms at his sides, watching Dunmore with an expression that had stopped being hostile and become something else. Something Olin didn't have the word for. Behind Ha'awi, Yampa Tukudu stood in the open, hands clasped in front of him, patient as stone. Dunmore looked at the men behind Olin. He looked at the document in Olin's hand. He looked at the canyon below.
Howie. It is Dunmore's path.
Dunmore held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode. Olin stood at the boundary until the sound of hooves faded into the plateau. Then he let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Behind him, he heard Ha'awi say something in Ute, quietly, not to Olin. Yampa Tukudu's answer was brief. Olin caught one word he almost recognized, the same word Sakwa had used when she named the Osha route. Something about what a thing knows and what it carries. He didn't ask for a translation. He stayed 2 more days. No particular reason, except that Sakwa was still weak enough that climbing in and out of the lodge required a steadying hand, and the smoke hole on Ha'awi's lodge had cracked through at one corner and was letting cold air in at night. Olin had some experience with roof repair. He'd done it at his father's house enough times. So he and Ha'awi spent most of a morning fixing it. They did not talk much while they worked. Ha'awi handed him tools when he needed them, and said nothing about Dunmore, and said nothing about the previous morning, and said nothing about anything really, until they'd finished and were sitting on the ground drinking bitter tea that tasted like the plateau smelled, sharp and cold and alive. And then Ha'awi said, Olin turned that over for a while. He wasn't sure he understood it. He was starting to think that not understanding things clearly was different from understanding things wrong. He wasn't sure yet which one he'd been doing. Sakwa found him by the horses the morning he was leaving. She was steadier on her feet, not fully herself yet, but near enough. She was holding something in her left hand, and she held it out to him without ceremony. It was a sprig of dried plant, pale green, woody stem. He recognized the smell, the sweet undertone he'd been trying to name for 4 days.
I know why you haven't left, Olin.
And I know why you haven't gone, Sakwa.
He wanted to argue. He'd been good at arguing at the Fairmont School, constructing a position, defending it, winning the point. He looked at the dried plant in his hand, and he didn't argue.
What school did they burn?
Sakwa looked at him for a moment. All of them, she said. The ones that taught what I know. The ones that kept the names of what grows here. They called it clearing land for progress. Olin held the serviceberry stem and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't worse than silence. Ridgepost's town council convened 10 days after his return. Dunmore had filed a formal complaint: overreach of territorial authority, interference with federal jurisdiction, conduct unbecoming. The council was 5 men and 1 woman, and Olin stood in front of them in his second-best shirt and told them what had happened, factually. The law, the documentation, the counter-signature requirement. He was very good at the factual account. He'd practiced it. It was clean and legally sound, and he could see, watching their faces, that it was working. All except for Councilman Reardon, who kept looking at him with a specific kind of narrow skepticism that meant the facts weren't the point.
Facts have been laid bare.
I have given you the facts.
I seek the truth, not a convenient arrangement.
I stand before you not as a judge of character, but of action.
Olin looked at the man. He thought about what he'd been going to say. The rehearsed version, the legal version, the version that made his actions sound principled and detached and professional. He said something different.
Prioritize the safety of our The council has considered your plea, Reardon, and the decision stands. You spent 4 nights in that encampment, Deputy.
The council voted 4-2. He kept his badge.
Legitimate operation. Help me understand why that was your call.
B. Trowell came to his office 2 days after the vote. She sat down across from his desk and said she'd testified on his behalf, told the council that what Olin had done in that lodge was medical assistance, nothing more political than that. Then she looked at the desk and said, "You've had that bundle sitting there for 2 weeks." Olin looked at the small wrapped thing, cedar and sage, and something he'd never quite placed. He'd moved it once to clear space for paperwork and put it back where it was without thinking.
You know it. I saw it on the street and knew it was yours.
Thank you, Bear. I know.
He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything more about it.
You didn't listen.
Yampa Tukudu came to Ridgepost 16 days after Dunmore rode away without his papers. He came alone, on foot, in the early morning before the main street had woken up, before the piano tuning saloon opened, before the trading post unlatched its doors. He walked to the jail, and he stood outside it for a moment, and then he left something on the ground in front of the door and walked back the way he'd come. Olin found it when he unlocked the office. Woven sage. A band of it, flat and precise, done with the kind of care that takes practice. The kind of skill that looks simple because it's been done 10,000 times by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. He picked it up. It smelled like the encampment, like smoke and cold and the plateau's specific sharpness, that thing he'd never quite been able to name. He stood in the cold doorway of the Ridgepost jail with the sage in his hands, and he thought about what Ha'awi had said to him on the last day, when he was tying his horse. Not to him specifically. Olin had caught it, asked later what it meant, and Ha'awi had been quiet for a long time before answering. "When we mark a man," he'd said finally, "we don't do it for him. We do it so the land knows his name." Olin didn't know exactly what that meant. He knew enough, though, enough to know it wasn't a trophy. Enough to know it was something you carried carefully, the way you carry a thing that was already old when you were born. Enough to know that whatever Sakwa had meant, about burned schools, about wrong hands and right instincts, about the names of what grows, that was a door he'd only cracked open, not walked through. He stood in the cold morning with the sage in his hands and looked west, toward the plateau's red rim, where the wind was already talking to the rocks, in that low, sustained voice that carried farther than it had any right to. The Fairmont School had taught him rhetoric, Latin, natural sciences, had given him a handshake from a congressman's son, had sent him west, believing he understood the shape of things. What the plateau taught him, in 4 days and a fever and a man's footsteps in the cold behind him, was narrower and harder and true in a way the school's truths had never quite managed. Do the thing your hands know how to do. Listen when someone knows more than you. And when the land tells you it knows your name, believe it. That's not a small thing. That's not a small thing at all.